probably need to back up a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to our next episode of, I'm going to back this screen up just a bit here. You probably don't care whether they cut the top of my head off or not, but it makes me feel weird. So anyway, good morning and welcome to our next episode of Ask the Agronomist. This is fitting that we're together this week. This is actually agronomist. Actually, before I forget this, I will plug that if you go to asgroandecalb.com, you can submit agronomic questions to a group of agronomists. I'm one of them. There's other people that I work with that will be answering these questions online. And for every question that gets submitted, I believe we're donating $10 to FFA scholarship. So if you go to asgroandecalb.com, both words spelled out with and in between, no spaces, no dots, just asgroandecalb.com. You should be able to find a link to go and submit any agronomic questions. So if you're not satisfied with the answer that I give you this morning, you might try that to maybe somebody different than me will get that question when it gets submitted, and you'll get the correct answer to that question. So just wanted to call that out. Happy everyone's joining this morning. We had some moisture move through the area last night and yesterday, and we had varying rainfall amounts. I've kind of pulled my group this morning, and 3/10 is the least that I've heard. 3 inches is the most that I've heard. We're actually joining with you here today again from Yetter's facility here in Macomb, Illinois. I appreciate Yetter for letting us use their really nice meeting facility, and actually I think Macomb area might be the epicenter of some of the heavier rainfall amounts. I know when I was driving into Macomb this morning, water standing in virtually every field in this area around here, and we were really dry ahead of the rain. So 2 and 3 inch rainfall amounts in some of the heavier areas. I know on my farming operation, the least I had on any farm was 1 inch. Talking to Chris Carlisle, who's my counterpart down towards Springfield, he had about 3/4 of an inch where he does his plot work at Auburn. And talking with some of my other reps east of the Illinois River, 6/10, 7/10, ½ inch, maybe as low as 3/10. And so I think everybody got some moisture. Also want to give a shout out to my daughter here. I'm wearing her T-shirt that she made for me for Christmas this year, and I jokingly asked her this morning if I get requests for these, how much she wanted to charge for them. So if you want your own, trust me, I'm an agronomist T-shirt. Look me up, and I'll see if my daughter wants to go into mass production on these. So anyway, we've got a few questions, and again, just as a reminder, I really like the back and forth exchange with our viewers here this morning. So if you want to chat in a question, you need to be logged in to YouTube, either with a YouTube account or with a Gmail or Google email account, and then you can use the live chat feature. If you're uncomfortable with that, remember we've got our mlc@bayer.com email address that producer Troy is monitoring, and we can get your questions there. If you think your FSR might be watching this morning, you could text them a question and they could chat that in. Whatever's comfortable for you. We'd love to get your questions. We do have some stuff ready to go in the queue, but if there are live questions that come in while we're here this morning, we will give those priority. Another thing that I think I want to mention, we were talking, some of us a day ago when we were dry and planting was going on and things were going crazy and nobody would have time to log in to ask the agronomist. We didn't know if it was going to rain or not. We probably should have set the expectation that if you're all really busy and you all got better things to do, that we might occasionally take a week off during the heat of planting season. The rain came through, worked out just perfect timing, give us all a little bit of a break, and hopefully you can join in with us here this morning. But in the future, if there's ever a week that it just really feels like you guys got better things to do than try to log into this, we might occasionally take a week off if that seems like the right thing to do. The other thing we're thinking about doing is maybe creating a podcast as well, so that we can put this content out via podcast if that's an easier way for you to listen on the go. And we recognize that if you're busy, you're in the field, you're working, you might be able to listen to the broadcast, but it's a little bit hard to interact and chat. So anyway, just want to get some of those housekeeping things out of the way. And Troy, why don't we get going with our first question here, which, as I recall, I think had something to do with residue management.
Yeah, so we had one come in on email. I haven't had any chatted yet, but so we've got a question on challenges with heavy corn stalks that haven't broken down. How we deal with that?
Right. So I wish my friend with Yetter was here this morning. He would be smiling, I'm sure, because we're talking about residue management from Yetter's facility here, and that's kind of their business with attachments and residue management. So I did get this call yesterday, actually, from a good farmer and dealer of ours in Knox County, and he'd had some customers and he on his own farm had observed that if they had a really healthy hybrid last year, or it was replant corn last year, or it was late harvested corn last year, that they were having some challenges getting that residue through planters and through tillage equipment this spring. And so that residue just had not broken down very much at all. The residue was heavy, the residue was fresh. We dealt with this a lot in the 2009 late harvest year. So in 2010, spring, fall in 2009, had a tremendous amount of challenges dealing with heavy, fresh residue that had not really hardly even begun to decompose. And so, a lot of different ways that people try to deal with residue. Vertical tillage has kind of become all the rage these days, and there's about as many different brands of vertical tillage tools out there as you can count. And in some cases, some of these fields where guys were having issues, it might have been due to fluffing and plugging of the residue. So when you chop it all up into real small pieces and it's laying on top of the ground in fluff, sometimes that's great for breakdown and decomposition over time, but it might not be great for getting that residue to flow through the equipment. In other cases, planters were riding up over the residue, not cutting through the residue, or didn't have row cleaners on them to sweep the residue out of the way. And as a no-till guy, my favorite thing to do with residue is just move it out of the way of the row unit so that you can get good seed to soil contact. I don't believe that the tillage necessarily needs to be involved in that. Now, tillage can help with break. So I want to know, what are some things you can do to speed breakdown and decomposition? You can plant earlier maturing corn hybrids. You can harvest earlier. You can do vertical tillage in the fall to try to speed up the breakdown decomposition of that residue. There are actually decomposition agents that some people will use, enzymes and things, to speed up microbial activity and decomposition. A little bit of nitrogen in the fall, a little bit of sulfur in the fall. You can feed those microbial populations to stimulate that breakdown. But what happens in some cases is if you harvest late and the air temperature, the soil temperature is already cool, that soil is already, the microbes are already starting to go dormant, and there's just not a lot of opportunity for that residue to break down. It's still early. We got an early start to planting this year. We've had a relatively dry, for the most part, relatively cool spring. And we just haven't really got soils woken up yet to the point where there's a lot of microbial activity going on. So there's a lot of different ways to handle that residue. But, the fact is that everything we do to drive better yields in corn, healthier hybrids, reducing crown rot, keeping that plant alive, using fungicides to protect that plant, increasing population to drive yields, all those things are going to make that residue more, in a sense, resistant to decay. And if that residue is in better shape, if that plant's healthier at harvest, that residue is going to be fresher. You're going to have more tonnage there. It's going to take a little longer for that stuff to break down. And you're kind of competing against yourself, things that would speed the breakdown of that residue. we have a lot of complaints in the fall when residue decomposition starts to occur before harvest, because that's when you get into stock lodging and that plant deteriorating and falling apart on you. And obviously it's kind of a balancing act there. We could breed corn that would decompose faster, but you wouldn't necessarily be happy with the harvest appearance and the standability of that corn in the fall. So everything we do to make the plant healthier, make the plant yield more, protect the plant, that's actually making the residue harder to deal with. So whether you deal with that residue through tillage, which tillage doesn't necessarily break it down faster, chopping it up into little pieces and getting it in contact with the soil speeds breakdown, but that may or may not improve plantability depending on what the issues you're having is. If you're having trouble with fluffing and plugging, breaking it up, chopping it up into little pieces, in some cases, could actually make that worse. If you can move it out of the way with a good set of row cleaners, residue laying between the row that's not interfering with the disc openers on the planter, that's not interfering with seed to soil contact, isn't hurting a darn thing. There's nothing wrong with leaving corn stalks 18 inches tall as long as you're able to plant between them, plant next to them. They don't interfere with the planter. And in some cases, when we've got these chopping corn heads and these vertical tillage tools that are chopping everything up into nice little pieces, that's nice for breakdown and decomposition, but it's also creating a layer of fluff right on top of the soil that can sometimes be, actually harder to deal with than with the planter. So it kind of depends on the nature of the problem you're having. Maybe more tillage would help. Maybe different tillage would help. Maybe row cleaners would help. There are a lot of soybean planters, especially 15-inch row planters, that do not have row cleaners on them. And I'm, maybe a little bit different than some people. I would rather have row cleaners than a set of coulters on a planter. I'm not a huge coulter guy. If you can move the residue out of the way, the coulter's not necessary. The disc openers themselves, as long as they're in good shape and set properly and not all worn out, the disc openers, if you've got good downforce on your planter, are going to penetrate the soil. The coulter doesn't really help you penetrate the soil. The idea of the coulter was to cut the residue in half so that you didn't hairpin that residue. I'll try to draw a picture here. If you've ever been looking at your seed furrow here, and you get put into the bottom of that seed furrow, that's what we call hairpinned residue. And when you put that seed right here in the bottom, and even if your press wheels come along and you get that trench closed back together tight like you like to, that seed is, you don't have seed to soil contact, you've got seed to residue contact. What you need to do really is this residue that's laying over the top of where the trench is going to be. If you get that cut, then you can move it easily out of the way and you get good seed to soil contact down in here. The other thing you can do if you don't want to cut it is just have a set of row cleaners working and just sweep it out of the way. So I like row cleaners on 15-inch row planters. Now I talked about plugging. They can actually make plugging worse. So it kind of depends on the configuration of your 15-inch row planter. Do you have room to get row cleaners on it? Are they going to, in some cases with 15-inch rows, when you sweep this row, it throws it all into the other row. So some 15-inch row planters, the row units are staggered front and back in the planter. Some of them are pretty close side by side, lined up across the planter. So depending on what type of planter you have, you may or may not have challenges getting row cleaners on there. But if you can get that residue out of the row, I don't really care that it's still there. Tillage itself, to bury the residue, burying residue doesn't make it break down faster. I don't know how many of you have ever built fence or tore out old fence or pulled posts, but you know where the zone of decay is on a fence post. The fence post always rots off right at the ground, right? So that soil surface, just a little above and a little below the soil surface, that's the zone of decay. That's where the biological activity is. And if you've got residue that's at or near the surface, that's where it's going to break down the fastest. The challenge with that is that's also where it's in the way of planting. So if you've got a corn stalk sticking up here, some people might think that looks ugly, but that corn stalk standing up 18 inches off the ground, that's really getting the residue out of your way because it's not near the surface. It doesn't necessarily break down faster standing there, but if it's not in your way and it's not causing any problem, it really doesn't need to be breaking down faster. What we need to manage is that residue that's laying here on the surface. So if you've got a lot of residue on the surface, you either need to be able to slice it in half or just move it out of the way. If you're trying to manage residue through tillage, typically that requires deeper tillage than we're doing in a lot of cases. And, if you've heard the term dilution is the solution to pollution, which is a little politically incorrect these days, but diluting that residue, moving it deeper in the soil. When we used the moldboard plow and you took all the residue off the surface and you deposited it 8 inches deep or 7 inches deep, however deep you were plowing, if you went back and dug that residue up 8, 10, 12 months later, it's all still there. Residue decomposition is actually very slow when you bury it that deep. Now, it gets it out of the surface, gets it out of your way for planting, gets it out of the way for seed to soil contact, but it's really not breaking it down faster. So it depends on what you're trying to accomplish with residue. The other thing that we get a lot of questions about is, all the carbon initiatives that are out there and people trying to qualify for some certain program. We get questions about, well, how much tillage can I do and still be no-till? Is vertical till okay? I think some vertical till applications are probably fine, but if you're running a high-speed disc across the field twice, or once in the fall and once in the spring, I don't think you're probably going to qualify for somebody's no-till or strip-till program with that practice. So we need to figure out a way that we can maximize yield from last year's crop, not get in the way of planting this year's crop, and still maintain enough residue cover that we're qualifying for our conservation programs. And that can be a challenge, and there's different ways to address that. And what's right for you, may not be right for the next guy. But just be aware that if you're going into some really heavy residue from late planted corn, some really healthy hybrids, or maybe late harvested corn, that you may see a difference getting that residue through your planter or through your tillage tool this spring. So I'll erase my picture here, Troy. What's our next question?
So we're getting some coming in on email, Lance. Let's stick with corn for right now.
Yep.
With the rally in the corn market, is this the right time to evaluate corn populations?
Okay, so I think anytime prices are high, people start to look at fungicides. They start to evaluate their fertility program. I guess looking at higher seeding rates perhaps. And when we make seeding rate recommendations, we take the cost of the seed and the price of the grain into account. So when I ran my seeding rate recs, I did that back earlier in the winter when we were at a much lower grain price than we are now. I think I was plugging in like a $3.50 a bushel grain price when I ran those scenarios. If you plug in a $4.50 a bushel grain price, you're going to get a higher seeding rate. And what we're trying to do with our seeding rates is reach that level of diminishing returns where an extra 1,000 seeds does not give you enough additional yield to offset the cost of the 1,000 seeds. And that's going to depend on how much is the cost of the 1,000 seeds and how much is the value of the bushel of additional yield that you're getting. And so we try to hit that sweet spot out here on the curve, what we call the economic optimum seeding rate. So if you're using the DeKalb tool that we have online to figure in seeding rates, it gives you the opportunity to put in your seed price, put in your anticipated grain commodity price, and it's going to give you a recommended seeding rate per acre. And if you use a lower seed cost or a higher grain price, it's going to give you a higher seeding rate recommendation just based on economics. So to answer the question, yes, in theory, the higher grain prices go, the thicker you should plant, because you can, justify getting an incremental yield easier if you're getting more for that bushel when you sell it. Now, we still have to consider, what's the yield potential of the field, what other management practices are in place. Are you going to use fungicide? Are you going to harvest the field at 28%? Are you going to harvest the field at 18%? What's your tolerance for, drying corn? What's your tolerance for down corn? And take all those things into account. But in general, to answer the question directly, the answer would be yes.
Okay. We'll shift over to soybeans here. Kind of a common topic that we've had is early planting, and so we've got a question on email here. How long can I expect my pre-plant residual to remain active if we're planting in early April? And so along with that, am I better off pulling that pre-plant application and just going with a post pass right as soybeans are emerged, followed by a second post at a more normal timing?
Yeah. So those are all really great questions, Troy, and a lot of producers have struggled with that. A lot of retail dealers struggle with that. What is the best herbicide program for early planted soybeans? And it is a challenge. It is a lot easier to get season-long weed control if your season starts May 15th than if your season starts April 1st. The kind of tried and true rule of thumb would be about 30 days of weed control out of a good residual program is what you could count on. Now, there are some situations where it might go a little longer, might go a little less. If you're putting it out really early into cooler soils, it's probably going to last longer. Weeds are germinating more slowly. Herbicides are breaking down more slowly in those cooler soils. So we probably will get some incremental residual control if you're applying it early, but it's not going to be an extra 6 weeks if you're applying it, April 1st versus say May 15th. So, our standard recommendation is to stay the course with your pre. We still need those good pre foundations out there. Do you apply it, before planting, at planting, or after planting? All the above will work. You do have to recognize that if you're putting that herbicide out there April 1st, you're going to need to be back earlier with that post application to get your overlapping residuals, because we're going to recommend residuals in the pre, we're going to recommend additional residuals post, and to get them overlapping, you have to get that post application on before the pre-emergence application breaks down. So if you put your pre out April 1st, you should probably plan on making your post application, putting additional residual out there by probably May 15th, which is going to feel pretty early for you, especially if it takes your soybeans 5 weeks to get out of the ground. They're going to be about that tall when you're making that post application. We need to stay the course with that. We need to get that before emergence residual breaks down. Now you can stretch that length of control out of that pre-emergence residual by putting it on after planting. The danger of that, and I got caught with this last year on my own farm, the very best water hemp residual products are PPO chemistries. PPO chemistry has to be on before you've got soybeans cracking up through the soil. So they don't even have to be up. If they're close enough to being up that they've cracked that soil open and you can look down and see that hypocotyl down inside that crack where that plant's starting to push up through, if you spray a PPO herbicide over the top of that field, you're going to damage those plants pretty severely. So you need to be getting that product on before those soybeans start to emerge, start to crack through. And if you get weather delays, so a good example of what we're in right now, I planted soybeans earlier in the week. I don't have any herbicide down on those fields yet. I just got 2 inches of rain on some of those fields. It's going to be a few weeks before those beans are up. So we've got time to get those applications on. But if weather delays don't allow us to make those applications, then I'm going to have to change my pre-emergent herbicide program, and I'm not going to be able to use products like metribuzin and the PPOs that are some of our best water hemp pre's in that program, and I'm going to be restricted to basically using a group 15 or a product with foamsafen in it, and those are good water hemp products, but they're not the best water hemp products that are on the market. And so we do have to take all those things into account. But generally speaking, I like to get my pre on close to planting. If you're going to plant really early, There is an argument that to be made that maybe you'd be better off to wait till after planting to make that herbicide application. But before you make that decision, make sure you consult with your retail applicator, make sure they're on board with that decision, make sure they know what you're doing. Don't just go plant 1,000 acres of beans with no herbicide on and not tell anybody you did that, because that will create issues for everybody down the road. So managing herbicides around these early planted beans is a real challenge. There may be some situations where the first herbicide application to early planted beans should be in the fall. Maybe if you're doing a fall burn down with residual in a no-till field, that's going to buy you a lot of time in the spring, give you more flexibility of what you can do in the spring. A friend of mine that works in retail, he asked me the other day, he says, well, what are we going to do if it becomes the norm to plant soybeans before we plant corn, to plant both crops at the same time? It is a real challenge for the herbicide application industry to figure out how to get all this stuff done in a really condensed time. And it's really difficult to spray corn pre and soybean pre all at the same time. We will have, if you do this early, if you're planting soybeans early, your first post pass is going to be going on at the same time that some people that planted more later, their residual pre pass might be going on at the same time. So we could be doing burn down, pre soybean, pre corn, early post corn, and early post beans all at the same time. And that is a real challenge for keeping those spray systems clean. You don't want your soybean, if you're using PPOs and your soybean pre, which I recommend, you don't want that anywhere near a field of corn. So if you're switching back and forth from corn pre to soybean pre, gets even worse when we get into the post scenario. We got to be really careful that we're keeping stuff straight. Some people can use dedicated equipment to do that, but so it kind of depends on what your situation is. But that is something that we really need to consider, and you need to sit down with your retail applicator and your chemical supplier and build the best program that you can build that works with the way you're going to manage your soybeans. I personally think the early planted bean thing is here to stay. I'm an advocate for planting beans before corn in some cases, and so I think we're going to have more and more soybeans that are getting planted in more of a traditional corn planting window. I think corn planting might actually trend a little bit later over time as people start to give preference for soybeans in that early planting window. So I don't think this is a fad. I don't think this is going away. I think that trend is going to continue, and we're going to have to figure out how to deal with it.
So, we've talked a lot about, promoted this idea of planting early beans. What about some of the nuts and bolts? So, what do we think about? Do we need to be adjusting seeding depth, adjusting population, row spacing, and so on if we're going to be going earlier and earlier?
Right. So good question, Troy. And there are, lots of people that have lots of theories about what they ought to do with early planted soybeans. I would say more people probably like the idea of early beans early because it gives you more of a spread in your harvest window. It's going to improve the yield of your early maturity soybeans. Some of the work that's been done on planting date has shown that you do get a little bigger bang for your buck from that early planting of full season beans. And when early planted beans first started over in, I'm going to say East Central Illinois was where some of the initial work was done on early planted soybeans. They were planting early group 4s early. And that was making them mature more like a 3.7, which would have been a typical maturity full season bean at the time. So some people believe that if you're going to plant beans early, they should be full season beans. Other people believe that if you're going to plant beans early, you should plant your earliest beans first. I subscribe to that theory myself. All soybeans, regardless of maturity, prefer to be planted early. All soybeans, regardless of maturity, will increase yield potential from early planting. The full season beans might increase yield potential a little bit more with early planting than early beans do, but you don't want to necessarily plant your latest beans first and your earliest beans last. That just compresses everything together as far as when they're going to mature at harvest time. And you also run the risk of, if you get a delay in your planting window, you run the risk of, if you plant your late 3s and early 4s first, and you've got your early group 3s and late group 2s left to plant, and it gets late, you don't want to be planting your late group 2s in June. So I'm more of a believer that you should, whatever your earliest bean is, if that's a 2.7, when you start planting, plant your 2.7s. If your earliest bean is a 3.0, when you start planting, plant your 3.0. If your latest bean is a 3.9, plant that last. That's generally my recommendation. As far as row spacing and population goes, I've really never seen any data to indicate that there's much of a difference based on planting date for row spacing or population. You'll see varying results. Sometimes 100,000 is the best seeding rate. Sometimes 140,000 is the best seeding rate. Generally, it's somewhere between 100 and 140 is where we think the economic optimum seeding rate is, but that can vary a lot from location to location. I haven't necessarily seen that vary with planting date. There is probably a concern or a nervousness or a desire on the part of some growers to, if you're planting beans really early, especially if you're doing it for the first time, and especially if you're nervous about it, to plant them thicker because it's early. You actually, if anything, probably want them to be thinner if you're planting beans early. So if you leave your seeding rate the same, they will probably be the same or thinner than beans planted later, because we do tend to get, instead of maybe 90 or 95% emergence, if you plant your beans April 1st, maybe you should expect 80 or 85% emergence. But if you're planting 120 or 130 or 140,000 seeds per acre April 1st, and you get 80% of those plants emerged, that's going to give you plenty of population for full yield. So I do not recommend increasing seeding rates with early planting. I don't recommend changing your row spacing with early planting. I'm a narrow row bean guy. Apologies to you guys that love 30-inch row beans. I like 20s or less for soybeans, regardless of when you're planting. You could make the argument that as planting gets later and soybeans tend to shorten up and they don't get as much growth, in theory, there should be a bigger advantage to narrow rows if you're planting later. But our research would indicate that there's a benefit to narrow rows regardless of when you plant your soybeans. So I wouldn't change my row spacing based on planting date. I would not change my population based on planting date, unless you're planting them too thick, and then I'd ask you to back it off a little bit on those early planted beans. As far as depth goes, I don't change that either. There are two schools of thought there. I've actually heard guys say that, well, I want to protect my early planted soybeans from early freeze, so I want to make sure they don't come up too fast, so I'm going to plant them deeper because I'm planting them earlier, and I want to delay when they emerge. Well, making them delay when they emerge somewhat defeats the purpose of early planting. Plus, you know that bean's going to struggle anyway, and I don't necessarily want to make it struggle through 2.5 inches of soil when it's in cold, tough conditions. So I like 1.5 inch-ish planting depth for soybeans. You can plant them shallower than that if you've got good moisture, and you can plant them deeper than that if you've got good conditions for emergence. But I'm usually somewhere, in that 1.25 inches, 1.5 is what I'm shooting for in soybeans, and I'm not going to change that based on planting date. I like to challenge people that if you think you need to shallow up your planting because you're planting early and because it's cold and because you're afraid that stuff won't come up if you don't shallow it up, then you should probably just not plant if that's where your head's at. Especially with corn, I wanted to spend a little bit of time on corn planting depth, and while we're talking about it, we'll go ahead and do that. So here's your soil surface. Here's your seed. Seed roots are going to come out. That mesocotyl is going to start to go up. Your crown roots, which is where your nodal roots are going to form, are going to set roughly halfway between the seed and the soil surface. And they would like to be about 1 inch above the seed and about 1 inch below the soil surface. So that, based on plant crop physiology, is where the optimal 2-inch planting depth comes from. Now, I'm sure there's some of you out there that are freaking out on me right now that, you've planted corn 1 inch deep and you've gotten a perfect picket fence stand and you felt really good about that. And if you're going to plant early in cold soils, you think shallowing up is the way to ensure success. Well, if you plant that seed an inch deep, same thing's going to happen. Mesocotyl is going to come up. Your crown is going to set halfway between the seed and the soil surface, maybe a little bit closer to the soil surface, 1 inch or less below the soil surface. And what typically happens up here when you get too close to that soil surface, you get dry soil or you get an open seed trench. And in either one of those scenarios, these nodal roots will not form. They will not start to grow. And that's where you get what we call rootless or floppy corn. And we've done planting depth studies over the years. My colleague Chris Carlisle has done several of these at Auburn where we've planted seed as shallow as we could get it. One year we did this and the birds ate the shallow planted corn seed. So you want to plant it deep enough the birds don't eat it. We planted it a half an inch, inch and a half, 2.5. And I think about the most we could get cranked out of the planter was, and more often than not, planting 3 inches deep will yield more than planting 1 inch deep. And year in and year out, I see a lot more problems with emergence and stand establishment from corn that was planted too shallow than too deep. So 2 inches is my number. 2 inches is where I want to be. You know, I don't talk knuckles because everybody's finger is different. I got short, fat, stubby fingers, so I can get 2 knuckles and maybe not be 2 inches. But, you know, 2 inches is where I want to be. If you're shooting for 2 and you end up with some at 1.5 inches, that's okay. If you end up with some at 2 1/4, that's okay. If you're set at 1.5 inches because you're afraid of 2, your shallow seeds are going to be closer to 1 inch, and I want to avoid that. So I kind of like to be a smart ass sometimes, as those who know me know. And what I tell guys is, if you're afraid to plant 2 inches deep because it's too cold, too wet, forecast too crappy, then don't plant at all. What's next, Troy?
So let's kind of stick on this early planted theme and talk about chill injury. What is it? Right. Should I worry about it? You know, what are your thoughts there?
Right. So I would say one of the biggest buzzwords in the last, say, 5 years in corn has been something called imbibitional chilling. And imbibing water, that's just taking up water. So imbibition is just the seed taking up water. Taking up that water is what kicks off the germination process. And you might have heard about that seed's first drink. Well, its first drink of water is just the water that it imbibes within the first 24 hours of going into the soil. If that first water that reaches, you know, the interior membranes of that seed and initiates germination is, I'm going to say, below 40 degrees. I actually think 38 is about the magic number. But let's just say if that first drink is below 40 degrees, that causes a lot of stress and some injury, and it can damage cellular membranes within that germinating seed. It doesn't necessarily kill the seed. It doesn't necessarily prevent it from emerging. But if it's a seed that, you know, maybe was a little bit weaker to begin with, that may be enough of a stress to either delay it to the point where it becomes a weed or prevent it from coming up at all. So if you plant corn into, say, 45-degree soil, and then your temperature just steadily, slowly climbs, you're not going to get into a chilling injury situation. Where we most often worry about chilling injury would be, say, a cold front coming through with rain. So let's say your soil is 50 degrees. So if you plant into a dry 50-degree soil, and 12 hours after you plant, a cold front comes through, and 36-degree rainwater is falling on your dry 50-degree soil, the first water that seed takes in is going to be pretty chilly. Now, it's going to warm up somewhat with the soil. It's not going to be as cold as the rainwater that's falling, but that would be a worst case scenario for chilling injury. It is a real thing. It does happen. There are probably scenarios where, based on what the forecast says is going to happen, we need to quit planting ahead of some of these cold fronts that come through. If you've got that seed in the ground for 3 days of decent conditions before it gets cold, now you may still have stand establishment issues if it stays cold and crappy for 2 weeks, but that's not necessarily due to chilling injury. That's just due to the fact it took too long to get. It takes about 110 heat units for most hybrids to emerge. And if it takes you a month to get 110 heat units after you plant, that seed's going to go through hell before it gets out of the ground. If you get 110 heat units in 4 days, you're going to be up. So chilling injury occurs typically when that first drink of water that seed takes in is below 40 degrees, and it happens generally within the first 24 to 36 hours of putting the seed in the soil. So that's why people talk about if there's a bad storm front coming through, and we know it's going to get cold and the temperature going to drop fast, and you're going to get cold rain falling on a field, maybe it's better to shut the planter down 24 to 36 hours before that happens, rather than planting right up to that event. Now the tricky part of this is, and everything's perfect in hindsight, and just like when's the best time to plant, when's the best time to sell, when's the best time to do anything, you don't really know when you're doing it. You can only use the information you've got at the time. I sold a lot of 950 soybeans last year when I thought that was a good idea. It didn't work out too well for me. So sometimes when you quit planting because of what the weather forecast says, and then you get 2/10 of rain instead of 2 inches, or it doesn't get as cold as they said it was going to get, then you've lost a couple of days of planting in the spring, and that can be frustrating. So just recognize that sometimes the right thing to do is to keep going. Sometimes the right thing to do is to quit. The trouble is, how do you make that decision? And you just have to understand that sometimes we're going to make the wrong decision.
So along with this, Lance, what about, how does seed quality play into that, and the seed quality testing that we're doing?
Right. So there's really 2 components. Well, there's more than 2 components. I would say for things that influence emergence, I'm going to say weather is number 1. I'm going to say hybrid is number 2. So this would just be the genetics. And then I'm going to put seed quality down here at number 3. So every seed company does their own internal tests to evaluate quality of seed. And we're all going to draw the line somewhere of, once quality falls below this level, it's going in the discard pile. It's not getting sold. Now, where that line gets drawn can vary from one company to the next. In some cases, it can vary from 1 year to the next. It can even vary from one hybrid to the next, based on the company's experience with that particular product and how good it has to be for most people to achieve an acceptable stand with that product. So those tests that are done, those internal tests that are done to separate differences, are done so that seed company can determine what's sellable supply and what's not sellable supply. Now, there is no guarantee that you could plant the highest quality seed in the world and fail to get a stand because of weather up here. So I don't care how good your seed quality is, no seed can hold its breath forever. So if you're in a really wet, saturated soil condition, wet, saturated soils are a lot more stressful than cold soils. So if you're in a warm, wet soil, that is actually the most stressful condition for seed, because the respiration of that plant is faster because it's warmer. So it needs more oxygen, and it can live without oxygen for a shorter amount of time in a warm soil than it can in a cold soil. So if you're going to be underwater for a period of time, you're better off to be cold than you are to be warm and underwater. But suffocation is actually probably the number 1 cause of seedling death in our part of the world, where we typically have saturated soil conditions too often in the spring. And if suffocation is the reason that your seed failed to emerge, better quality would not have helped you. Now, if it was just it took too long is the reason that it didn't emerge. Better quality or vigor will get you faster emergence, but different genetics can also get you faster emergence. So if you've got a hybrid that tends to be slow, hybrids that tend to be slow just require more heat units to get out of the ground. And if you've got a hybrid that takes 125 heat units versus a hybrid that takes, say, 110 heat units, if there's a difference in 15 heat units and we're accumulating heat units at 2 a day, which we sometimes do when we're having those tough spring conditions, that's where you can see a 2-week difference in emergence between two hybrids in some cases. And being slow doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a bad stand, but at some point, you know, that seed's only got a limited amount of time to get out of the ground. And if it takes too long to get out of the ground, you might get a crust. It might just run out of gas. You know, at some point, being faster is better. Now, being faster is not always better, but there are scenarios, and we had a lot of these in 2020, where if you got out of the ground 3 or 4 days quicker, you ended up with a better stand than if you came up 3 or 4 days slower.
So we got a just on the chat here. Is this chilling effect also applicable to soybean?
Good question. So theoretically, yes, soybeans can experience chilling injury as well, but the planting date studies that have been done on soybeans would indicate that, you know, it really isn't something that I think we need to be fearful of in soybeans. I think that's partly because soybeans can compensate so much for a thin stand. We do tend to get reduced stands if you plant really early, but we don't tend to see yield reductions from thin stands of early planted soybeans. We actually see yield increases from thin stands of early planted. Can stress and chilling injury reduce emergence of soybeans? Yes, probably can. Is it something that I worry about? No, it's not, because getting them in the ground early is more conducive to high yield in soybeans than getting a perfect stand. Corn's just the opposite. Getting a perfect stand in corn is more conducive to high yields than getting it in early. So you don't necessarily want to plant corn late, but you know, if you plant corn early, you know, say 1st of April, there really isn't any data to indicate that April 1st corn has higher yield potential than May 1st corn. So in theory, the only thing you're gaining is you're getting the work done on June 1st. So if you've got 15,000 acres of corn to plant, you're going to have to start early. With soybeans, you know, not only are you getting work done, there's a lot of data to support that, you know, April 1st or April 10th or April 15th planted soybeans have more yield potential than May 1st or May 5th or May 15th planted soybeans. So not only are you getting the work done, not only are you moving your planting season up, not only are you going to move your harvest season up, with soybeans, you're actually increasing the yield potential of your crop.
So we've got one more question on the chat here. Talk about plans for inclusion of Roundup, XtendiMax, Liberty, and residuals in XtendFlex soybean.
Okay. So there's a lot of layers to that onion there. So the XtendFlex, as most of you probably know, is a 3-way resistant soybean that is resistant to Roundup, Liberty, and dicamba. So those 3 herbicide products can be used, you know, pre, post, over the top of those soybeans. We're not really ever going to make a recommendation where all 3 of those are used at the same time over those soybeans. So the amount of, say, Liberty that you use in your XtendFlex soybeans is going to depend upon how much dicamba are you using in your XtendFlex soybeans. So obviously dicamba has the ability to be used pre because it has that residual component. So if you're in an area where you've got challenges with applying dicamba post, a lot of people will use the strategy of putting out residuals with dicamba pre, and then they'll come back with Roundup and Liberty or glufosinate post emergence on those soybeans with additional residual. If you're in a scenario where you can apply dicamba post, you may use dicamba pre and post. And then if you need a late rescue application, maybe after a cutoff date or when you're no longer comfortable applying dicamba, then you've got that Liberty option to clean that field up if you do need another application. I would say if you do the pre correctly and you do the post correctly, there will not be a need for that third application in season in the vast majority of situations, even if you're planting early. But a lot of people do like the idea of having that Liberty option for that late post rescue type application. So the reason we're not going to make a recommendation of XtendiMax and Liberty together, they may go on the same acre, but they're not going in the same tank for multiple reasons. For Liberty to be effective, it needs to be small spray droplets and really good coverage because it's a contact herbicide. So you got to be careful not having too much drift control additive in there. You got to have spray tips that are making smaller droplets. And you need a heavy slug of ammonium sulfate in there to increase the efficacy of glufosinate or Liberty. You really don't want to do any of those things with dicamba in the tank. So if you've got XtendiMax in there, we can't use AMS because it increases the volatility. We need large droplets to control drift. We need drift reduction agents to be on label and control drift. So those two products are really not compatible with each other from the way they need to be applied. So and XtendiMax together, one of two things is going to happen. If you're set up correctly to spray dicamba, you're wasting your money on the Liberty because it's not going to kill anything if you're set up right for dicamba. If you're set up right for Liberty so that it's actually going to control something, you're off the XtendiMax label 6 ways from Sunday. So you really can't tank mix the two, but I think there will be a lot of scenarios in XtendFlex soybeans where either pre or early post, we're using XtendiMax, and then mid to late post or in sensitive areas, we've got that Liberty option. So I guess that's my recommendation. And whether you're using dicamba pre or post, whether you're using Liberty post, whether you're using both dicamba and Liberty, we need residuals in that system pre, and we need additional residual post to get that overlapping residual, to get that season-long weed control that we're looking for, so that you don't find yourself in a situation where you're out there too late trying to kill weeds that are too big, either with an off-label application of XtendiMax or with an off-label application of Liberty, or applying to weeds that are too big for either of those products to effectively control.
Okay, I think we got through most of our questions. Why don't we wrap things up with a planting progress update, and then anything else you've got on your mind, I guess.
Okay, all right. So appreciate all the questions that got chatted in this morning. Had some really good things to discuss. So just a little bit of a planting update. Talked to several of our reps, and as is typical for this time of year, planting progress is widely variable across our little part of West Central Illinois. As you drift south towards Quincy, you could probably find producers that are very nearly done with planting. As you slide north up towards Galesburg or over towards Bloomington, you'll find individual operations that have got a lot planted. You'll find a lot of people that haven't started planting yet. I got a text from a grower last night that was curious about whether next week would be a good time to start planting or not. With the rainfall amounts that we've got, I'm not sure anybody's going to be planting in my neck of the woods next week. The weather forecast looks a little challenging next week, not necessarily from heavy moisture, but just being cool. So the crops that are in the ground, I'm not particularly worried about those, but they're not going to be making any great progress here over the next week to 10 days. But you can find areas where there's a lot of crop in the ground. I do think it's interesting when the first planting progress report comes out. I'll be very curious to see if USDA finds that there are more soybeans planted on that first report than there is corn planted. In my part of the world, that would definitely be the case, and I'm contributing to that on our farm. We've got 320 acres of beans in the ground that I feel really good about. We've planted no corn yet. I feel really good about that as well. And I think there's a lot of guys that have planted more beans than corn. Probably more people in some areas that haven't planted anything yet, and that's okay. And there probably are a few people that have got more corn in the ground than they have beans. And I don't know there's anything wrong with that. I'm going to give priority to soybeans in these early windows. But, if your, personal bias tells you that I don't want to be the guy that everybody's talking about in the coffee shop because he's got all his beans in the ground and he's not done with corn yet, and it's the middle of June, that is an awkward situation to find yourself in. So it's kind of a judgment call and a lot of variation, but there's a lot of early beans in the ground. This was a great year to give that system a try if you ever wanted to. Everything that got planted in this early window went in perfect soil conditions. And that's what makes me feel good about, early planting windows. I don't like doing anything early when it's marginal, but we really had perfect conditions for whatever you wanted to plant in this early window this spring. Looks like maybe the early window may have passed, because by the time we get dry again, we may be not necessarily in a quote unquote early window at that point in time. So we'll be back again with Ask the Agronomist in 2 weeks. So 2 weeks from today, which I think
April 22nd.
April 22nd, producer Troy says. So please be back with us April 22nd. If you didn't get a chance to ask your question, please send those questions in. We always start the next episode with questions that come in after the previous episode. Move those right to the top of the queue. And then we'll be back with you again in 2 weeks. So everybody stay safe. Enjoy Agronomy Week. Remember to email those questions in to asgroandecalb.com to generate some, take some of Bear's money and give it to FFA scholarships. And we not touchscreen.